All right, hello. This is my final project for thinking psychoanalytically from the sciences to the arts, which is going to be a sort of psychoanalytic take on song lyrics by The Strokes and the Voidz, two bands with the same lead singer-songwriter, Julian Casablancas. So, really excited to be doing this project. It was a very interesting course that has definitely affected the way I think on an everyday basis, just because there are so many applications of psychoanalytic principles in everyday life that I feel like are difficult to catch unless you either are a psychoanalyst or you take, a class about it like I did. So it was very interesting, and I'm really excited to kind of take, what I learned and apply it to two bands that I really enjoy, that I've always thought had like some sort of deeper elements to their songs, and now I get to dive in a little more and actually talk about some of them. So, before I get started, what I was planning on doing here was I will talk about the background of the Strokes and the Voidz, just because there's some necessary context that will be helpful when I discuss the song lyrics. Um, and then in addition to that, I was going to just talk about interpreting song lyrics from a Freudian standpoint as a whole, and kind of what that entails, and how song lyric interpretation as a general concept also has psychoanalytic principles, even if you're not consciously attempting to be Freudian in your analysis. So I'm going to start off with that. So in class, we talked about how poetry is one form or one medium that can be used in psychoanalysis, and I very much agree with that. And I would also argue that song lyrics are a form of poetry. Therefore, I would also agree that they can be used for psychoanalysis. Of course, the main difference between song lyrics and poetry is that song lyrics are, in most cases, accompanied by some sort of instrumentation. And that is something I'm going to touch on later on in terms of some of the Voidz songs. But regardless, I do think that song lyrics kind of bring about a different perspective on psychoanalysis. It's not obviously not the exact same as verbally speaking to a patient, but there's like just a difference there that you can still glean that I think is useful. And if that sounds vague, obviously I'm going to go more in depth as we go on. But I also want to make clear that obviously I'm not a psychoanalyst. I have zero training aside from this class and taking AP Psych 5 years ago. So I don't mean to imply ever during this podcast that my interpretations of song lyrics or my interpretations of what's going on in Julian's head are correct. In a sense, it's kind of like my own psychoanalysis too, because I am kind of imposing my own experiences onto Julian, even though in many cases I know, like, because he's obviously a very famous person, and his many of his life struggles are public. So in some cases it's easy to tell. For example, his relationship with his father is very tumultuous, and it's something that I know will come up later, and that's something that you can tell is present in a lot of his lyrics. But aside from things like that, there are some things that I really need to speculate on, and it's very possible that I'm imposing some of my own unconscious, whether they're desires or issues, something from my childhood. It's very possible that I'm imposing my own experiences onto him. So that's important to note before I start. Another thing is that I wanted to avoid this analysis being a very surface level interpretation of lyrics without a Freudian twist on it, which is a difficult task because, as I said, I'm not, trained at all. And these are, in many cases, very vague songs, even for the rock genre. But one thing that I've definitely come to appreciate as I've been preparing for this podcast is that Freudian analyses and psychoanalysis as a whole, when you compare them to interpreting lyrics, are really very similar, because as I've been saying, what I'm kind of trying to do is put myself in the head of a songwriter and understand what could be driving this person to be making this claim or to be using this particular word. In doing so, I'm really kind of attempting to assess what's going on beneath the surface in his or in their unconscious. So even though I say, yeah, I don't want this to be just a lyric interpretation, I do think that there's some validity to the idea that lyric interpretation on its own is by nature Freudian. So that's just what I wanted to get out of the way before I started talking more about the band and the songs. Both that I feel like it's all really tied into psychoanalysis inherently, even when I'm not trying for it to be. And obviously I will have cases where I go much more in depth. And in addition to that, I understand that I might be imposing my own unconscious struggles or beliefs throughout this entire podcast. And that's something that, I mean, frankly, that's just human nature. It's not something I can avoid, especially as, someone who's untrained. But I do think that it makes for a more interesting analysis overall. So now just getting into a bit more of who this person is, who these bands are. The Strokes are an alternative rock band from New York City that became very, very popular and famous in the early 2000s. 2001 is when they released their debut record. And prior to that release, there was a huge fight among labels to get them signed. It was like a very big deal at the time in like the rock scene. They were dubbed like the saviors of rock and roll. It was like probably the most popular band ever was. I would argue was right when they released their first album, roughly, which is kind of weird given that was 20 years ago, and they're still very popular in like as a rock band. But regardless, that was kind of their beginnings, and ever since then, they've released 6 total albums. They had 2 follow-up albums to the first one. It was 2001, 2003, 2005, so an every other year kind of thing. Then the bandmates had a bit of a fallout. They took a hiatus after the 2005 record, then came back, released their next one in 2011, 2013, and they just released one in 2020, and they're back and active again. So they've had a couple hiatuses, but overall they're still going steady now. They've like sort of rekindled, and they've set their issues aside. And one thing that's going to be interesting to note throughout this entire podcast is that clearly they were very popular at the beginning. They're still popular now, but they kind of, I mean, it's kind of sad to say this, but I think one could definitely argue that they peaked very early, and that is kind of present in a lot of their lyrics. Like there's this sort of, it's a mix of longing for the past, but at the same time, it's actually more so that they don't want to be tied to the past, and they're tired of being told like, oh, make songs that are more like your first album. By they, I mostly mean this songwriter, Julian Casablancas, very much wants to move on and make sort of different kinds of music, even though he understands that the kind of music they made on their first couple of albums is more commercially successful, which is kind of where the Voidz come in. The Voidz were established. It's Julian's band. The other members are not from the Strokes. They're completely different aside from Julian. He established that side project during the band's second hiatus in between 2013 and 2020. The Voidz have released 2 albums, one in 2014 and one in 2018, and they're kind of like, the analogy that people always say is like, the Strokes are what makes Julian money, and the Voidz are what make Julian happy. And that's very much like oversimplified, because the Strokes, especially now, do make him happy, and the Voidz are not some like extremely small-time band that no one's ever heard of. Like, yes, they're relatively unpopular, but it's still, the headliner is still also the lead singer of the Strokes, so it's still like a pretty big deal. And they also have more music on the way in the next couple, I think next year probably they'll release new albums. So they're sort of Julian's more like creative outlet, and it's kind of more what he wanted the Strokes to evolve into. So that's kind of just a quick background on who the bands are, and now I can get into some more specifics of song lyrics and touch on some general themes. It'll be mostly the Strokes, but the Voidz kind of have some songs that are really rich in and have a lot of depth in terms of lyrics that can be analyzed with a psychoanalytic lens. So there are a few themes I'm going to touch on here. The first one is I'm going to talk about a couple of songs that really sort of epitomize the insecurities that Julian writes about in a lot of his music, but in these 2 songs, they're kind of the most prevalent. And that theme is like I'm saying, since it's in so many songs, I want to start with it, because as I continue to go on, it won't be worth it to mention it every single time, but it is worth it just to establish it, if that makes sense. And then after that, I'm going to do a deeper dive into a couple songs. Eyes of the World, which is very much just loaded with Freudian references and sort of lyrics that can be taken one way or another way, but the way that I interpret them is very much one that is psychoanalytic. And then finally, the last song I wanted to talk about was Human Sadness, which is not by the Strokes, it's by the Voidz, but that is where it's kind of Julian's goodbye song to his father, who passed away shortly before he wrote it, obviously. And it's a very long song, and the instruments and the lyrics and everything just combines to kind of emphasize the very mixed emotions that Julian is experiencing in coping with the loss of his father. the two of them did not have a great relationship. So starting off was sort of this theme of insecurity that kind of pervades all of the lyrics. There's a song called "You Only Live Once," which was on the Strokes' third album, which came out in 2005. It's actually one of their most popular songs, like ever, but it also happens to have some Freudian applications, so I'll start there. So yeah, this one's pretty straightforward, but the very first few lines of the song are, "Some people think they're always right. Others are quiet and uptight. Others, they seem so very nice. Inside, they might feel sad and wrong." So that's, I mean, I doubt I have to even explain that too much because that's one of the rare times where his lyrics are very much like what they appear to be on the surface, in my opinion. Essentially, he's just saying that people will put on whatever face they want to the world, but deep down they might be going through something. They might be misrepresenting themselves, whether that's consciously or unconsciously, and you can't really assume that whatever you're seeing out of a person is their authentic self. And that's the overall theme of the rest of the song. I don't have any more lyrics to share from this one, but essentially the gist of it that I have here is that people have unconscious insecurities that prevent them from showing their true selves to others. And these insecurities prevent people from ever truly getting to know each other or understand each other unless you have a really close relationship like you're talking about, your significant other or a family member. So really this song is actually, on the surface, a frustration that he had with dating. I believe he got married right around when this album came out, but obviously this song was written before. And he was essentially just complaining that dating is fruitless because you don't really get to know people because everyone's always sort of putting on a facade when they're in the public sphere, which I think we all can agree with. Whether it's a conscious facade or it's unconscious, nobody is really ever their truly authentic selves with people that they just met or don't know very well. I think that's agreeable. And then that also takes me to another song on the same album called 15 Minutes, which expands on these same thoughts. So 15 Minutes is a little harder to understand than the last song. It's not just, a straight up on the surface complaint about dating, but rather it's actually about a dream, which I'm sure has, someone familiar with Freud has them perking up all of a sudden. But the first lyrics of the song are, "It was all just a dream, oh no, yet I wish it was real." So that right away kind of establishes, the narrative of the song that, was it a dream or was it not? And I find it interesting that the next line starts with, "All my pets, they were there." And I find it interesting because there's really not much discourse about this line anywhere that I could find online. And it's not a very popular song in their discography, to be fair, so that's probably why. But regardless, I think that it reminded me of, for example, sometimes I'll have a dream that's so realistic that I can't tell when I wake up if it was real or not, and it takes me, a solid 30 seconds, 5 minutes to realize, oh yeah, that minor event that happened, that didn't actually happen, that was a dream, And I think that one of the things that is a constant in those dreams is pets. He says, "All my pets, they were there," which in some cases helps you know it's a dream, and in others it doesn't. For example, I've had so many dreams over the years where I'm just sitting watching TV, eating, doing something innocent, and random, mundane, I guess. And my dog will just be there sitting in the corner, just sleeping, or he'll walk over to me, again, nothing very interesting or deep, but it'll happen and he'll be there. And that's great. But my dog died 6 months ago, and he was the first major pet I ever had other than fish. So one thing I've noticed in my dreams since his death is that he's in my dreams every night almost, at least in terms of the dreams I can remember. And it's not so much that he's just sending messages or anything. It's not that deep, but rather it'll just be the dreams that I've been having my whole life where he's just sitting in the corner, I'm just petting him, nothing that's that big of a deal, which actually I kind of like because the dreams are so vivid that in a sense it's he's still there, and I could probably do a whole other podcast on this alone, but regardless, I think that the presence of a pet in a dream is something that can signal to a pet owner in either direction that either they're dreaming or that it's real life. So I think it's interesting that he includes this line, "All my pets, they were there," because to me, it doesn't really help me as a reader or listener understand if he thinks he's dreaming or not. But if I were him and I had, more experiences with those pets, I would probably be able to know. And of course he does think it's a dream because, like I said, the first line is, "It was all just a dream, oh no, yet I wish it was real." But at the same time, it's still kind of vague the rest of the song whether it actually was a dream and, whether he's still in a dreamlike state as he's, singing. It's all very open to interpretation, which I actually kind of like. But going a bit deeper into the song, there's more to it than just, was it a dream or was it not? Because in the dream, he's at this party, with, he's there with the girl who I'm gleaning from the lyrics is out of his league, and that might be why he wishes the dream was real, because he wakes up and realizes that he can't actually be with this girl. But that's just part of it. The more interesting part to me is that there are other people at this party, and one of the lines that he says is that everybody's so inviting. They've got it in for me, I know. The juxtaposition of those two lines is interesting to me because everybody's so inviting, sounds nice, like they're genuine, they're happy he's there. But then he says, they've got it in for me, I know, which has a more negative connotation, like they have some vendetta against him or they don't actually want him to be there. And this kind of goes into the general theme of insecurity that I've been trying to start to lay out here, that like, even if everyone seems so inviting, he is so, caught up in his own insecurities that deep down he thinks that they actually don't like it. And it might be true, but at the same time, I think that these might be just his unconscious sort of insecurities coming to light. And it's something I can, relate to an extent. I'm not really the most outgoing person. Like, you wouldn't find me at these kind of parties that he's at, most likely. But if I were there, I probably would feel the same way. Like, even if everyone's being nice to me on the surface, it's kind of difficult because if you don't know people that well and you can't read them that well, then how do you really know if they want you there, if your presence actually adds anything? Like, it's difficult, and it's something that I think is pretty relatable. That's probably why, part of why he wrote it. But then the song takes a turn as you keep going, because like I said, they all have it in for him, in his opinion. But later he kind of has this epiphany. It's actually one of the more positive moments of their song that I can find. And this is that he realizes that it doesn't matter if they want him there or not, if they have it in for him or not, because tomorrow none of this will matter. The exact line is that everybody at the party shouldn't worry if I'm there. Everybody at the party shouldn't worry what I wear, because today they'll talk about us, and tomorrow they won't care. So that's just really interesting to me, because clearly he suddenly realizes, like, you know what, to put the dream stuff aside, who cares if they want me here or not? Like, this will all be over tomorrow, so I should just try to enjoy myself. I thought that was interesting because it's one of the rare times where in his lyrics, he doesn't let his unconscious desires get the best of him, and he allows himself to enjoy whatever it is he's doing without, fearing anything. And then the dream kind of ends in this song where he says, like, this whole life, is it a dream? I can't tell. I got up, then I waved, then I fell. And then the song, both in the instruments and the lyrics, kind of like enter a kind of paranoid state of craziness, and it all kind of ends shortly after that. So a really interesting song to me, because it both highlights the insecurities that he has with, like, whether people actually want him around, which is so constant, both in the Strokes and the Voidz lyrics. But then, as soon as he realizes that it doesn't matter whether they want him around, and that it's just one day, and, like, just, relax, have fun, as soon as that happens, he falls down, and, like, he's wondering, is this a dream? Do I want this to be a dream? And the whole thing is just so, there's a lot more I can say about it, but it's just not even one of the main songs I wanted to talk about. I just found it really interesting that, there are these two things going on at the same time. The debate about whether or not it's a dream, and then the whole discussion of insecurities being brought up to the surface. I find it interesting. But now I can move on to Eyes of the World, which actually is also from this same third album. I didn't plan for that. I guess this album just happens to have a lot of references to it. It also happens to be my favorite album of their 6, which is both an unpopular opinion, and it's kind of interesting given that all these songs seem to have a lot going on with them. Maybe that's related. But this one's called Eyes of the World. By Eyes of the World, it sounds like it's supposed to be a double meaning with eyes, because the way you're hearing it, it sounds like, like eyeballs that we look with, but it actually means eyes, I-Z-E, the suffix. And it's like a creative song, because the ending of every word in the chorus, the ending of every line, not every word in the chorus, ends in eyes. Eyes of the World, in essence, is a very political song. One of the most political songs the Strokes have ever released, because usually Julian's political opinions are more apparent in songs by the Voidz. But essentially it's a song about anti-imperialism is like the message. When I talked about how every line in the chorus ends with the "-ize" suffix, some of those words include criticize, terrorize, desensitize, vaporize, neutralize, tranquilize. Like clearly, these are all very strong words that, in the context of the song, are meant to critique imperialist countries that do all these things to either its citizens or others throughout the world. So that's like the main thing going on in the song, but really behind the scenes, there's this whole like psychological element to it that I want to talk about. So the third and fourth lines in the song are, "Sometimes it feels like the world is falling asleep. How do you wake someone up from inside a dream?" So that's another dream reference there by Julian, but kind of an interesting way to set the table where he's critiquing also the people within these imperialist countries. Maybe not to say that they are the problem, of course, but to mention that they are kind of just running through the motions of their day-to-day lives without any real passion or excitement, as if they're kind of like maybe not dreaming in a positive way, but they're just falling asleep, like he said, like they're not awake and truly understanding what's going on around them. Then he goes on. The next line is, "Your mind would wander and search for its place in the night." So that's again another interesting line because your mind would wander and search for its place. That part, without talking about the night for a second, is obviously a very introspective line where you're kind of maybe dealing with the unconscious a little bit. Like your mind is wondering, how whether or not you play a role in imperialism. Maybe that's kind of what he's going for there. And the ending of that in the night is really interesting to me as well because I think that it kind of talks about a very common thing where you kind of have this like level of thinking about life at night. I don't know. I feel like some of the times that I'm most introspective, whether that's about myself or about the world around me, they happen to be at night. Maybe that's just a me thing. Maybe I'm again like projecting my own views onto the songwriting here, but I don't think it's coincidence that he used the word night there, and I definitely just wanted to mention that. Then as the song progresses, we start seeing some themes of sublimation and denial, particularly if you go past those lines I just mentioned into the pre-chorus, right before the pre-chorus. He says, "Once that your music was born, it followed you round, and then it gave your activities meaning and let you be loud." So this might be kind of hinting at the idea of like music as an escape from the struggles of everyday life, but also moreover, I think it kind of references sublimation in that you're sublimating your unconscious or maybe the fact that you feel meaningless into music, and as he says directly in the next line, it gives your activities meaning or gives your life meaning. So that's kind of one example that I thought could constitute sublimation. And then if you keep going now into the pre-chorus where he says, "You're sad but you smile. It's not in your eyes. Your eyeballs don't change. It's the muscles around your eyes." That's another interesting line to me because it talks about like if you're sad, why are you smiling? Kind of. It's not in your eyes. Isn't like that's kind of the way to tell when someone's smile is forced or not ingenuine, because there's like the expression you smile with your eyes, and if you know someone really well, you can probably distinguish between their real smile and their fake smile there. But in this case, the person smiling is denying their own struggle, whatever it is, because clearly this person is not truly happy, and they're denying unconsciously whatever is going on with their life. Maybe it has again something to do with the theme of imperialism and the fact that they're uneasy about living in a world that tolerates it so much. So again, just another a lot of themes here with sublimation, denial, and the idea of unconscious thoughts, and self-assessment at night. But then there's even more than that, because once he gets past the first chorus, the next verse starts with, "Your dreams are sweet and obsessed, and you're overworked. You're overtaken by visions of being overlooked." So again, two more interesting lines there. Again, another reference to dreams. So it seems like now the dreams are an escape from everyday life. If your dreams are sweet and obsessed and you're overworked, it sounds like the dreams now are themselves acting as the escape that music was representing earlier, if this person is overworked. And if the person is overtaken by visions of being overlooked, that's another very common, Strokes example of your own insecurities, being at play. If you're worried about being overlooked all the time. That's obviously something that's going to boil up to the surface every now and then. And then finally, there's one more example in the same verse, because a lot of the lyrics are repeated after this, since the chorus is mostly the same and the pre-chorus is the same. Like for example, in the next pre-chorus, he mentions the night again. Like, night after night, you turn off the light, which is kind of another reference to going through the motions. But there is one, the last line I wanted to talk about from this song, which is also in verse 2, is, am I a prisoner to instincts, or do my thoughts just live as free and detached as boats to the dock? Again, a very Freudian line, so many of them in this song. Am I a prisoner to instincts, in the sense that, maybe that's where, id, ego, and superego come in. Is our id controlling us, in this case, even though we're actively attempting to suppress it? Are we a prisoner to our id? And then when he says, or do my thoughts just live as free and detached as boats to the dock? That's a little bit of a paradox there, because if your thoughts are really free and detached, that really, the analogy of boats to a dock don't really work, since boats are still attached to a dock and don't really have freedom. So I think he's really commenting on the illusion of freedom here in this sense, and maybe arguing that we are indeed prisoners to our instincts, and that no matter how hard we try to escape from whatever unconscious, insecurities are weighing us down, we cannot, because any sort of escape is only superficial, like a boat being tied to a dock, and you're really always controlled by your insecurities no matter what it is you do. So again, that's just a really, in my opinion, really interesting song. But there's so much going on there. But now I'd like to move on to the relationship he has with his father and the song Human Sadness, which is by the Voidz, not the Strokes. So Julian's relationship with his father is very complicated. I'm obviously not going to talk about every detail, because that, could take a full podcast on its own. But they had a very complicated relationship. His father, whose name is John Casablancas, who passed away in 2013, was actually famous himself. He's partially responsible for what we now know to be supermodels. The idea of that even being a concept is partially his doing. He was an American modeling agent, and he founded a very famous modeling agency. But he also, has a few problematic aspects of his life. He often ended up having relationships with these models. They were not always of legal age, and that was one of actually the reasons that his own son doesn't really respect him. So there's a lot going on there, of course. And when he passed away, or after he passed away, the Voidz released Human Sadness, which is an 11-minute song, very unusual for Julian Casablancas' song, and it just kind of really a extremely interesting trip. It kind of crosses through so many genres and so many themes, but the whole thing overall is it's sort of Julian's own account of the emotions he's dealing with after his father's death. And the whole thing is very Freudian, both because it's really a song, it's a boy wishing that his father loved him more, essentially, after his father has died. But it's also, within the song, there are just so many emotional highs and lows, and the instruments even come in to support that. And overall, I would say the song is about dealing with depression and the mixed emotions afterward due to their complicated relationship. I would also say the whole song feels kind of freely associated on its own from a composition standpoint. Because like I said, it's 11 minutes. It's not just the same thing over and over for 11 minutes. There's so many twists and turns. It kind of feels like Julian's stream of consciousness as he works through his emotions of being without his father. So in that sense, it's also, in my opinion, kind of Freudian. So I think it makes the most sense to just go through it in order, kind of like I did with Eyes of the World. Not going through every line, obviously. Like I said, it's 11 minutes, but the ones that stand out. So the main thing is that the chorus, which is one of the few things that's repeated consistently throughout the song, is worth noting. It's a modified version of a quote from Rumi. Rumi being a 13th century Persian poet and philosopher that Julian likes. And the words are, "Beyond all ideas of right and wrong, there is a field. I will be meeting you there." I could, again, I feel like I've been saying this a lot, but I could do a whole podcast just on that particular line. I feel like it's so powerful. But in the gist of it, I think Julian is saying that the relationship he had with his father was neither right nor wrong. In that, as bad as it was still not completely wrong. There were still some redeeming qualities, which I think, I can't relate to having a bad relationship with my father, which I'm very fortunate for, but I feel like if I did, I would understand there still being redeeming qualities in a bad relationship. So I understand where Julian's coming from there, I think. And when he says, I will be meeting you there, I assume that that's both like a double meaning in that when Julian himself dies, he will, be meeting his father metaphorically in this field that is not quite right, not quite wrong, but just whatever it is. Maybe there's not a word for it. It defines the relationship. So that chorus is repeated many times throughout the song. There's a theme going on throughout the song of the father, or the character. He never explicitly says father, but it's very obvious to anyone who knows anything about Julian that it is his father. About the character asking his son to fix his tie or to help him with his tie, and Julian always says things that are negative about this, like, "I don't need your tie. I don't need to. I'm tired of saying it. I don't want to fix your tie." Those were all different lines throughout the song, but I think obviously the tie is a metaphor. Maybe there was some actual moment in his life where he was asked to help with his father's tie, and there was some fight about it. But I do think that it's kind of a metaphor for his dad always being on the move, like fixing your tie is something you do right before you leave the house. And he didn't see his father much growing up. His mom raised him, so maybe that's part of his like unconscious like anger. Or I guess at this point it could be conscious, even his anger that his father wasn't around much. But the only time he ever was, he was asking for Julian's help, perhaps. So yeah, that's like one of the interesting themes from the song. As we go on, the instruments, which at one point is actually a sample of a Mozart track. So it starts out kind of like on a calmer note, but then eventually it gets a lot more harsh with like dueling guitars, and it becomes louder and like somewhat like abrasive even to hear. But not in a bad way. Like it makes sense because it's like going through the 5 stages of grief almost. Like there's like the calmer, and not necessarily in order, but there's a calmer sound. Like maybe he's accepted it at the beginning of the song, but then there's like the anger portion in the middle where the instruments get more harsh. So in the 5th verse, that's where we really get a lot of the interesting content that's very explicitly about his father. There is one area where Julian says, "Not your son, not your friend, not your enemy," and that's, to me, I take that as kind of like his idea of what his relationship with his father really was. And it's kind of where I feel like the song gets its psychoanalytic aspect, because it's, we talk so much about early childhood and parenting when we talk about psychoanalysis. And it's, like I said, this whole song is just Julian kind of regretting that he and his father did not have a better relationship, and it seems like blaming that on his father. Because if he doesn't feel like a son, doesn't feel like a friend, but also doesn't feel like an enemy, then it feels like the father-son relationship here is just weird. And it's difficult to place. I certainly can't place it because I don't have their experiences together, but whatever it is, I'm sure there's some sort of unconscious, pent up frustration that's clearly coming out in this song. Then later off in the same verse, there's one line where Julian says, "He's not my son, search his home," which I'm assuming is symbolic, but essentially maybe embodies the feelings that John had for Julian, which is like, if he were given a chance to betray his son, maybe he was, he would say, "He's not my son, search his home." Like he's okay with the idea of Julian being, somehow searched or put into trouble, and his instinct is not to protect his son. So I take that as Julian being really upset that his father was not more protective of him or did not, support him, even though Julian, himself was very successful while his father was alive. From a lyrical standpoint, that's really it in terms of Human Sadness. I mean, obviously there's a lot more, but it's not outrightly, psychoanalytic in my opinion, which is why I'm choosing to not cover it all. But in essence, I think the idea of writing a full song, an 11-minute song at that has so many both instrumental and lyrical turns, where some of it's more calm, like at the beginning. It ends on a calm note as well, by the way, I should add. And then in the middle, there's all this, intensity and anger, and, "He's not my son, search his home," kind of like, almost like with a vengeful tone. Like, it's very conspicuously a song about his relationship with his father, and I assume that it's sort of even sublimation of the song itself, because he had all these feelings about his father. Who knows how he felt comfortable portraying them, but clearly he was able to channel them into this song, which is, very popular, not even just among Voidz fans. It's their most well-known song, the Voidz, not the Strokes, but clearly I would argue it's sublimation in that he channeled his negative feelings about his father into a very, well-liked, musical piece. So as I head towards my conclusion, I just wanted to, before I, wrap up with my thoughts, just mention a few more minor examples of Freudian or psychoanalytic instances of Strokes and Voidz lyrics. One that I wanted to mention was a song called Modern Girls and Old-Fashioned Men, which is by Regina Spektor and the Strokes. And in the song, Regina Spektor and Julian Casablancas are both singing at the same time. The whole song is really like an argument between like a boyfriend and a girlfriend, it seems like. And the one thing I found really interesting about it was the song ends with Julian saying, always thinking about yourself, over and over. He just repeats that. And as he says that, Regina says, like at the same, like to the same tune, like accusations, like first saying like you don't love me is the first one, but then kind of saying like, okay, what you're saying about me is right. So she says, I am an animal, I am not practical. While at the same time he's saying, always thinking about yourself. So it's kind of like he's saying, all these insults to her, and essentially they are resonating with her, and she's like, yeah, you're right. Like she's realizing that he's right. But then the very last line of the song is they both say at the same time, was I? Which I really like that line because it has, a lot of layers to it. But from Julian's standpoint, when he says, was I, he was saying, always thinking about yourself, a bunch of times. So then when he says, was I, he's asking, was I always thinking about myself, actually? And it's kind of, I think, the way I interpret it is actually, yes, he was actually the one thinking about himself the whole time. And he was just projecting his concerns onto her because he wasn't able to grapple with, the fact that he was the one who was being inadequate. So that's like his realization. Whereas when Regina says, was I, she's saying, like, was I always thinking about myself since he was the one accusing her? That was her way of saying, like, I don't actually believe that I'm an animal. I don't actually believe that I'm impractical. I'm just saying that because it's what you're projecting onto me, and I'm just trying to, like, get you to realize that it's not really, my fault. So I just found that song really, it's kind of humorous, actually, but the message there that it's really the man who's at fault and that he's just projecting onto her is, a very common thing that we see, but the way that they pulled it off in the song with both of them singing at the same time is something I wanted to note. That's one example. Another is there's a song by the Strokes called Automatic Stop. Now, there's one line I wanted to talk about in this song, or two lines rather, sorry, but he says, she wanted him, he wanted me. It's just a phase that's got to pass. So that's interesting to me because the pronouns there are of note. She wanted him, he wanted me. So if we're implying that there's some sort of like love triangle there or some like sexual angle, if Julian's the one singing and he wanted me, that implies, homosexuality. And the next line definitely does when he says it's just a phase that's got to pass. That's, what people say to people who are gay and attempts to like convert them or whatever. Like, oh, it's just a phase, you'll get over it, when it's really not. So I think that is one really fascinating line that could hint to like repressed homosexuality in the Strokes lyrics. I do know that Julian himself is not straight. He was married to a woman for 15 years. I believe they recently divorced, but he definitely has had some sort of relationships with men before. So I don't know what he identifies as, but it's worth noting that that's one of the few times in the Strokes lyrics that side actually comes out and that the pronouns are used that clearly state, a man being interested in a man. And the last song that I wanted to briefly talk about was by the Voidz called Leave It in My Dreams. Obviously a very overtly Freudian title. But really the song, the main character or the narrator of the song, Julian, says that he is just trying to search for truth and not overthink it. He just wants to slow down and waste his time, is the way he puts it, with the person that he loves. And it's implied throughout the song that the reason he wants to just slow down and waste his time and not overthink it is because he doesn't want to have to face and rationalize the bad decisions that he's made throughout his life. And he says the line is, I will leave that to my dreams and never let it bother me. So that's, obviously very Freudian because he doesn't want to have to actually cope with what he has done. He wants to leave that to his unconscious, to his dreams, and he'll never let it bother his conscious self. I find that fascinating because in so many of his other songs, he has, including songs that I've analyzed in this podcast, he has basically stated that there's no escaping your unconscious. No matter what you do, it's going to catch up to you. So I think it's kind of maybe the character he's portraying in the song is naive, thinking that, oh yeah, I'll just leave my mistakes to my dreams, they'll never bother me, not realizing that, somehow later in life or even in the near future, they will come up to the surface as they tend to do in Julian's view. So yeah, that's all I have from an analysis standpoint. I think that ending with, some examples of potentially unconscious content coming to the surface was interesting, in addition to obviously the deeper dives I did earlier. But I think from this experience of gathering, all the notes on these songs and recording this podcast, I just definitely have become aware of like new interpretations of the songs that I hadn't previously considered or maybe didn't consider in enough depth. So it feels like I'm, as a big fan of the vast majority of these songs, kind of at a new, like the gateway of like a new sort of rationalization or like experience of the meanings, which I think is really cool. Um, but obviously, what I talked about at the beginning of this whole thing before I got into the songs is how I'm not a psychoanalyst. I'm not, you know, surely my interpretations are far from perfect. But then again, Freudian analyses and lyric interpretations are kind of one and the same, given that I'm putting myself in a songwriter's head, and also that it's really not so much about the songwriter but myself. It's my own views that I'm imposing, my own experiences that I'm drawing from. As much as I try to keep it to what I know about, for example, his relationship with his father, I'm sure that some of my interpretations and like free associations, in a sense, are coming from my own experiences, and that's something that I can't escape. But at the same time, I think that's really the beauty of the exercise and what makes the field so interesting. So yeah, this is a really great course. I really enjoyed applying psychoanalysis to many different fields, and then finally applying it to bands that I like. I found really fun and eye-opening, and I hope that I was able to portray that in this podcast and show that I have engaged so much with psychoanalytic thought and with kind of just rationalizing with the whole question of like, am I analyzing myself or am I analyzing Julian? That in particular over these last few days has been really interesting to me, and I've been thinking about that. But thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.